Hi, everyone. My name's George Gilbert. I am privileged to be facilitating a conversation with two august individuals in the mobile industry. Just by way of background, I'm going to date myself. I was back at Lotus working on notes 20 plus years ago, and I also was enterprise software research analyst under Frank Quattrone, and no, I didn't go to jail. But I did collect $200. So with that, Larry.
Hi, everybody. I am Larry Jordan. I work at T-Mobile as a director in the product management group. My role there today is to build great mobile web experiences and use those web experiences and application solutions to deliver one-to-one marketing offers to customers to give them a better experience with T-Mobile. In the past, I came from the internet world, worked at Netscape back in the day, so to date myself. Worked at Yahoo back in the day, did a few startups as well. Thanks for listening to us today.
Hi, my name is Brian Lent. I'm the founder and CTO for Medio Systems. Medio is probably the largest predictive analytics company in the cloud. We started in 2004, became a mobile-first company. So my background is technical in nature. Been in the analytics industry for a couple decades. Probably most notable of some of the things I'll talk about here is I had a company actually down here in the valley that we sold to Amazon in the late 90s that became the core of the Amazon recommendation system. So sort of the genesis of taking a lot of this into the mobile industry. We should get into it. I also want to thank T-Mobile for their generous offer for everyone who's able to stay late. You get a free Galaxy 3, so I think that's a joke. We agreed we'd keep it lively. We want to make this engaging and fun, so we thought, yeah, I would like a Galaxy 3.
So would I.
Well, let's take this as a jumping off point, like the Amazon recommendation system, since that was both data and analytically driven. And one example that the three of us had talked about in sort of setting up the context for the panel was the Moneyball example, the book and the movie about the Oakland A's and how really they were mavericks and they took a data-driven approach to picking players and eventually sort of picking plays themselves. And we all know we're in a world sort of awash with data, so we want to understand and talk about how that can be best applied in mobile experiences and across platforms. So taking that as a jumping off point, in the movie and the book, it was basically a one-time event to do a better job with stats in terms of making player decisions and then ultimately even game-by-game choices. Is that the same today in how we apply this to B2C scenarios, or is there a slightly different recipe? Brian, why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah, I think what's interesting, I think back then, at least from my perspective, not being an athletics person per se, but the concept of Moneyball is that here's an industry that's been established for a long time with baseball, and yet, in my view, they took some additional attributes about players, and they used real predictive analytics across these attributes to look at stats that mattered more than what the common industry thought mattered at the time. And the result was their ability to really make a much more dynamic team. I think that's back then in an industry that's not nearly as dynamic as the enterprise. This is an interesting AppNation this year in particular because it's sort of the confluence of the enterprise and what's happening with the enterprise and the app economy. And so in that context, there needs to be much more real-time engagement. So a lot of the things that I think we'll talk about here and the differences with predictive analytics, number one is it's not standard reporting. So the goal isn't to just build a report off of it. It's actually to affect some game or some operational system to improve it to the benefit of the consumer. And in that context, it needs to be much more real time. So rather than, I think in the Moneyball case where it was sort of pick the team and then go, this is about actually taking these analytics, embedding it into your game or app, and actually having the game itself improve. Again, kind of thinking about Amazon, if we all use Amazon as a consumer, it gets better and better over time, and that's the idea. So there's a much more real-time component. It's about predicting the future behavior intent of the consumer, and then that itself generates new data. So it's kind of this closed loop, virtuous cycle, and so that data itself then fuels back into the system to make it overall smarter. So I guess it's a much more dynamic system.
So, Larry, can you give us some examples of how you've applied this methodology and the technology?
Sure. Before I even talk about the technology, I want to just step back and give Brian and Amazon some kudos in some of the great work that they did at Amazon. And I want to give you an example of some of the ways that we can use data to not just improve monetization, but improve people's lives. So when I got really addicted to using data to provide a better experience was a number of years ago. I was browsing the web, and Amazon realized I had a couple of young girls, and they popped up an ad for me to buy one of the Disney princess movies. Can't remember what it was, but it was the perfect right time, right place, right moment. And I bought that and completely forgot about it. A few days later, I walk in the door. My daughter jumps in my arms and says, "Daddy, Daddy, thank you so much." And I thought, well, wow, what did I do? It said, "Thank you for the movie." And that's the power of what we can do with data. So there's some great ways we can help not just make more money for our companies, but we can actually help people, give them the right things, what they're looking for at the right time, improve their lives. A couple other examples for that, where you were talking about continuing to optimize. So at T-Mobile, one of the things that we do is we have data plans. And we're constantly looking at ways we can deliver more data to customers and what do they want to use with their data and how do we want to upsell the data to them. And we actually are running A/B tests continually to figure out how to improve that process, to look at the data that we have and look at disparate forms of data to figure out when they might need a new data plan, when they might need higher data speeds. It's not just, wow, you've consumed this much data, but maybe if someone's looking at a lot more video, they're going to need a new data plan. And we should help them at that point. And not only that, but warn them when they're going to go over so they don't incur penalties. Those are the kinds of things we're using the data for.
I was going to say, that's actually, I wish I could tweet this right now, but I think that's the first I've heard the term data addiction, which actually makes a lot of sense. I think I'm a data addicted.
Maybe between the two of you, let's sort of drop down and look at how you might be helping Larry ask better questions about how the customers are interacting with the offers, and then how that gets translated into better cross-sell or upsell recommendations from your service.
Sure. Yeah, so we, do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay, so we want to make this lively and interactive, but not get into a bunch of slides, but I thought it might be helpful. We talked about this, about showing some concrete examples before we kind of go first, so you sort of see the impact to your business. So I put I put together some metrics from past customer deployments where we've integrated these analytics into this like closed loop environment. And so what this shows you is that you generally get these pretty significant lifts in whatever the KPI is or metric that you're measuring. So this is a particular example, and again, this is data that's been sort of anonymized and scrubbed so we can show it to you. But basically what it shows on the bottom left is a particular metric that is basically, repeat customer visit rate. And so, it's trending along, reasonably well, but then at a certain point in time, the system was launched where a predictive analytic engine was implemented into the system itself so that what the customers experience on the day after launch started to develop a much more personalized experience. So as the consumer engaged with this set of applications, they started to remember preferences and made recommendations that were more appropriate to them. And obviously, given the one-to-one nature of mobile devices and how personal they are, this is actually what sort of, drove the consumers to click on ads better or purchase some of the recommended products. And the other thing, too, that you see about this chart, which is one of the reasons I wanted to highlight it, and I thought for our discussion, George, because you brought up this notion of kind of the data, kind of continual evolution. Do you see can you see from that way, the audience, how the chart kind of continues to go up at a slight incline? that's actually part of that machine learning component. So there's one aspect of introducing analytics, predictive analytics into your apps. It's another to actually take what the consumers do. Do they react positively or negatively to what you're showing them, and then tune the system, oftentimes in real time, and then the next thing that user sees or some other user, it gets better. And so what you're seeing is the system is getting smarter and smarter over a period of weeks as it's deployed. And that's the idea of it getting stickier and getting to be better. So that's kind of one example. In this case, it was a 5x increase in usage. Not everything always generates that much lift, but that's a big deal when you talk about the margins, at least in the mobile app economy. But certainly from a big enterprise, that can have a pretty big impact to net margins. The other example was click-through rate on ads. So these were kind of a combination of ad units, but they're also promotional items. And so the prior system that was running live in this particular case was getting about a 3.2% click-through rate, which is what you see to the left of the blue line, or sorry, left of the red line. The blue line itself. And so, that's actually not too bad. So if you have an app and you're getting 3.2% or thereabout click-through rate on your offer wall or your ads, it's actually pretty decent. So what we end up doing on this particular day is launching an analytic model that was actually looking at real-time clicks and navigation, how you navigated the mobile experience. And based on that would then change the type of ads that or recommendations that were shown. And that click-through rate jumped to, this is about 9%. And again, you can kind of see it continuously grow. Some of the dips or ebbs and dips or weekend effects and such. So again, a really great example, I think, of where it's in a closed loop example. We're not talking about showing a basic report, and that report is something a human looks at and tries to make a decision. These are actually integrated into the experience. And the last one I was going to show, and I'll leave it at that, was just some industry metrics that have been reported across kind of the last 5 to 10 years, showing different types of analytics and how they've been able to show and demonstrate ROI to businesses. And I think the one that's of interest, and you may not be able to see it all in the back of the room, but on the far right of this chart, where you're getting a 10x, these 10x lifts to key metrics in ROI, is where you're taking these predictive analytics and you're integrating it into the game, and you're doing cross-sell and upsell promotions. You're creating very personalized offer wall experience, as an example. You're predicting who might churn, and based on that, you're showing them the next best offer to keep them engaged in your app or your game, as a particular example. And there's a bunch of companies, not enough, I'd argue, and that's why I think we're all here, that do this really well. So one's, an Amazon, sort of my alma mater. I think we all know and can appreciate that from a consumer perspective, how they use analytics. Companies like Netflix that have a similar recommender system. Zynga, I think, is a really good example that does a lot with A/B testing. But there's others. Harrah's in the casino industry, Tesco. These are some companies that have demonstrated use cases where they're getting 5 to 10x lifts to their core business because they figured out how to incorporate the predictive analytics. So,
let me ask Larry. I want to ask you a question about if we look at the customer life cycle as acquisition, engagement, monetization, retention. So let's say you have theoretically 100 units of resources for these 4 knobs. Do you allocate them 25, 25, 25, or how do you change the resources you put behind each knob, and how might that change over time?
Well, I think that there's a lot of ways to answer that question. So one, clearly depends upon the business that you're in and what stage you're at. But at one point, all those pieces need to work in concert together. So I can use data today to go look at who might be the best customers for T-Mobile throughout the United States and target those customers. I can also then figure out the best way to onboard those customers. But the biggest piece here is, how do I want to maximize my overall revenue? So it really is a true life cycle issue of looking at the customer over the life cycle, and how do I not just pull the most money out of them, because that's a very short-term way to look at that, but how do I create the most satisfied customer? One of the key pieces is to focus on very detailed questions, and in many aspects, what we hear people talking about is general cases for the solution. And what we found is if you create the general case, you never really apply it. So one of the best ways to start on this is actually to apply it to a specific problem. Let me give you an example. So one of the things that all you customers of carriers hate is bill shock. And what we're trying to do is reduce bill shock, not have you surprised at your bill. So when you come into a store to buy a T-Mobile data plan or a T-Mobile contract and we say, hey, do you think you're going to make any international calls? And most people say, no, I'm never going to make an international call. I don't want that plan. And then what we found a while ago was people would start to make international calls. They'd get shocked that the international price was so high. T-Mobile would get blamed or a different carrier because, wow, why are you charging me such high rates? So one of the things that we're doing from a lifecycle perspective is we're actually looking at customers who made those international calls after they've made them. And we can come back and tell them, hey, you're going to have a very expensive phone bill this month, but we can help you lower it. Sign up for an international calling plan, and all of your calls internationally will be cheaper. So what's interesting is we first started offering it in the store. People really didn't want the plan. We then started offering it to a large range of customers within their first few weeks of experience with T-Mobile, and they still didn't want it then. But what was really interesting is when I deliver an offer to a customer who's just made an international call and say, would you like an international calling plan to lower your bill? I get more than a 25% click-through rate, more than 25%. I mean, people are really excited when they get a 2 or 3% click on an ad. We're talking 25%. And so it's looking at those specific use cases and how we can do that.
Okay. Let me follow up on tying actually into the Zynga element of the chart, which was, I had talked to them now, it was a couple of years ago before sort of they went south while they were still, growing gangbusters. And they tracked immense amounts of information. They had 250 node Vertica clusters, one for production reporting, one for ad hoc. And there was not a standard way for them to instrument the apps and then find the actionable information. One of the questions they asked was, what made these games socially engaging? And it turned out, I forgot whether it was Farmville or Cityville, it's not how many neighbors you had, but like how many stores or franchises you had in a friend's territory. And so they changed the game to emphasize that. So that's an example where one company is like vertically integrated all the way back into the analytics function. How would you work, how is your approach different so that you can still get the domain expertise of the game developer and the domain expertise of analytics provider to work together with and make that secret sauce?
Sure. I mean, I'll give a particular example, and maybe you talk about some of the things T-Mobile's done. And this is probably not, well, maybe some of it's Medio related, but some of it's kind of best practices. So one is, and I think you mentioned it particularly, is sort of instrumentation, right? And hopefully everybody here has instrumented their applications and you're collecting a lot of rich data. Everyone sort of acknowledges if you're not collecting data, then you can't reinvent it. So whatever happened in the past, happened in the past. So probably the number one thing you can do is make sure you're taking your games and apps and actually collecting as much of that raw data, even if you just store it away. Like that's thing number one. We've taken an approach because we kind of approach the problem from the other direction, right? If you know you want to optimize ARPU, or you want to increase the percent of your user base that are whales from non-paid, whatever that optimization is, you can then work it backwards and say, well, gee, these are the 10 attributes that most affect a consumer's ability to be a whale or to be to churn. So when you know that, then you can instrument the app to begin with, right? You know what type of clicks matter and that you want to track. So one of the things that we do is focus on a per domain basis, so gaming versus mobile network operators or financial services or healthcare, right? As you think about enterprise, other spaces that this really applies to as well beyond kind of even the app economy today. Each of those domains is going to have a different set of core attributes that really drive personalization or drive ad clicks, and it'll vary. So one aspect is just making sure you're logging the right attributes so you can use them later in building some of these models.
So is that part of your offering, that domain knowledge for, say, an operator?
Sure. I mean, that's part of what we've done, over the last 7 or 8 years, is to build that domain expertise. And whoever you guys decide to work with, I think that's one of the things to look at is, looking at that historical knowledge and sort of institutionalized. Over years, you get to know people on certain versions of Android devices in certain parts of the country, have a different pattern than other devices in different, parts of the country or different parts of the world. Just because there's regional differences. And the goal of the analytics is ultimately to capture that. But you can only capture that if you're actually logging those in the application.
Yeah, I think the interesting point there is there is no secret sauce to creating the best offer, the right offer for the right person at the right time. And while there's one school of thought that says, wow, big data, I'm just going to turn a machine onto it and figure it out. And there's one school of thought that says, well, I'm a really smart guy and I can figure out the most obvious paths and make the offers to the customer. I think at the end of the day, it ends up being both of those combined, and that's the real piece. As Brian mentioned, you've got to store the data. But what you also, as people who manage your own businesses, knowing your customers, you have a sense of what you think is going to work. And it's always best to start with what you think is going to work. Look at that data that you think is going to work and start making offers to customers, start analyzing the data and looking at what works, and then use the machine to figure out how to augment, to find those correlations that are not obvious at all. And I think that's the best way to work with any of the providers. You can know that they have the expertise on the machine side, but I think you all have the expertise on who your customers are and what you know and think they'll do. And it's best to start with those hypotheses.
Let me follow that up with sort of a step down in detail, which is we're always getting more information, whether from new sensors or like third-party, syndicated data sources. What information would you like to have that you don't have now that could have a big impact on any one of those stages of the life cycle?
That is a tough one.
You should have it all.
I should exactly.
Are you bumping up into, in one of these stages where you're like, geez, we don't really know this, we can't measure it, we can only intuit?
Sure. Well, here's what's really interesting for us. It's about retaining customers over the life cycle. So I actually think it's most important to deliver that serendipitous experience to customers. Really what we want to have is not customers who are paying a lot of money for T-Mobile. I want customers singing about how great T-Mobile is. So part of this is, what is that serendipitous experience that's going to make someone recommend T-Mobile to their friends? That's the biggest piece, and I think that's tying all the data together. What is the one thing, or what are the 10 things that we did in concert to give you a great experience?
That, well, it sounds like it's many data points and you have to provide a causation, not a correlation.
Correct.
So that sounds tricky. That's a mixture of both of you together.
Yeah, well, I think, in terms of data attributes that we have seen in this industry in mobile, like, some of the things that are obvious, right? Location information is one of the most richest new elements coming out of the mobile industry that the PC world didn't have. And there's a lot of other privacy issues, and Apple has policies on UDIDs and such. And so I'd say the pieces that we would like to see, because we know they build better models, which means it builds a better experience for the consumer, is obviously location information. The other is consistent cookies, right? So having a persistent user identifier across these different devices, and frankly, as we're all using our different devices, and I think some of the themes today and yesterday in the enterprise track was around there's multi-screens, different devices, right? And so the idea is there's all these different channels we're going to consume media. So when you switch from your mobile device to the TV, how do you log the information that as you interface with the TV into one consistent, common view of the customer. I think operators have, to some degree, an advantage because you have that actual knowledge, but that doesn't transcend beyond the mobile device. So I'd say location is really, really a core one that we see. The analytic models getting a lot of benefit, and the others kind of having that persistent identifier. There's one other thing, we skipped this, but I want to go back to it. It was that life cycle, because I think for a lot of our customers, there's an acquisition life cycle that they have as you acquire new consumers, gamers, or otherwise. Then you go through an engagement process, which is kind of building that trust and that excitement and stickiness. And then you can start to think about how to monetize them. And then certain aspects in certain of those customers then churn off. And so a lot of what we realize we have to do is, I think, similar to what you were saying, Larry, and that is decide that right balance between acquisition and customer satisfaction, right? If we all had an experience where there's no advertising, we all might argue that'd be a better experience on mobile or or watching TV, but that's not how the industry works. And so when you think about the idea of a system pushing content to consumers that are ideally making it more personalized, I think that's always a trade-off, right? You want to optimize monetization, or do you want to optimize a great consumer experience, and how do they work together? One will lead to churn, the other doesn't, and it's kind of a fine balance.
And actually, if you do it right, those ads are going to add value to the customer experience. So what's really interesting is where Brian was showing some charts before and showing click-through on ads. Well, if you think about it, that click-through rate of, as an example, 0.5% was actually a negative experience. But that click-through rate of 20% was actually a great experience. You've actually delivered what the customer wants. And I think that's the key there, is how do you make these solutions work in context? You can actually make more money and please the customer, and that's the end game. That's what you're trying to do.
So I think, are we out of time?
Okay. Oh, so
Yeah, very
Any quick questions? One, and then we'll be out in the hall.
So much of this is after the analysis, the monetization is based upon inference. I've seen a couple interesting things. For instance, in a Georgia like Christie's would subset out a group and actually send them a question, and then they use those people as a proxy. Have you seen that? And seen that used effectively to increase the click-through and monetization rates?
You mean like a panel? They would use this as a panel to do a test?
To create a panel and then give it them and offer to monetize.
So the question is, have we seen used in instances where they would create a panel, it sounds like, of individuals, and then use that as a basis to improve the monetization?
Actually, an online panel.
Oh, an online panel?
Fairly significant.
Sure, I mean,
Yeah. So we've actually done that in a number of ways. So for one, before we launch new products, we often do user testing. And sometimes that user testing is actually using solutions where we deliver a beta app to 100 people, and we get them all online at the same time and have them experience and provide feedback to us. We also do it sometimes in a blind way, where we might change the experience to 5% of our customers, and they don't even know that they're in that test, but we're looking to see how they're responding to something new, and then we're using that to decide, well, people liked that offering, we will offer it to more customers, or people don't like that, let's stop doing that. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, so we're doing that constantly. It's kind of a standard operational procedure in our business.
well, thanks. Thanks for everyone for staying, too.